Namaste and in Lak'ech, and welcome to this episode of One World in a New World. I'm your host, Zen Benefiel, and this week's guest is Anshar Seraphim. He is a high-stakes negotiation trainer, business analyst, psychology specialist, and VP of critical thinking at the Octopus Movement, which is where we met. He is also the chief of cognitive and behavioral design at Haystack. So we're going to have an amazing conversation. This gentleman is one of the most intelligent people I've ever heard speak. You're going to have a blast. I will too. Stick with us. We'll be right back.
Explore the thoughtless sphere. Embark on a life-changing journey of self-discovery. Embrace harmony with self, with others, with Earth. One world in a new world. Zen Benefiel skillfully ignites conversations, guiding guests to reveal personal journeys and perspectives. Listeners are inspired to seek knowledge and find wisdom in their own lives. Join this transformative journey as we navigate the depth of human experience.
Anshar, it's so great to have you here. My experience of you has just been, it's really opened my eyes to what more is capable of how people can communicate and the depths of their thinking and articulation. And I'm honored to have you here with us today. Thanks for coming.
Well, thanks for having me. It was just a cool opportunity to have a conversation since we were both connecting in the Octopus Movement, so I welcome that.
And being one of the chief officers, I'm honored that we can have that. Um, So, as you know, the conversations that we have for One World are centered around being able to bridge the inner and the outer. We're bereft of having those conversations that expose the inner to others, because inherently, when we do, it's rough, chunky, sounds way out and wacky, and we're often, thought of as being weird or insane or crazy, and given a stiff arm as a result of that. Well, that's uncomfortable and it shuts us down. We don't talk about that. So now we're at a time critical in this history of our planetary civilization where we've got to make a shift. And this is kind of what the octopus movement is doing. They're drawing out the neurodiverse in order to discuss things in different ways that haven't been addressed yet. And I really think that that's an imperative in this real use of diversity, not the DEI stuff that we're seeing is more, what they call it, quota filling. Um, so that being said, when you first began, and I know you entered this world with some extra challenges, gifts that made you into who you are today. What did you experience and what was it like? And I know that you had talked to me about the Seraph-Whorf um,
The
syndrome,
Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, yeah.
Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. I told myself I didn't want to forget that. What did I do? I sort of forgot it. Interesting how you can tell yourself something even though you don't want to do it, and you end up doing it, right?
Good
Mine
example of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, well, mine doesn't pay attention to do or do not. It just pays attention to the topic word, the subject matter, right? So how did it begin with you? I know you were nonverbal to begin with, but what was that like and how did it help you to then, acclimate a little differently and rise to this really intelligent young man that I'm speaking with now?
Well, I was about 75% nonverbal until age 11. I was raised in a house with two music teachers in it. So
Hmm.
and I had sensory processing disorders. So I could never understand why, with all the lessons going on in the background constantly, and you could never escape it, um, why it caused me so many physical problems, because I turned out that I have synesthesia. Um,
Hmm.
and so when I hear sounds, I actually feel them on my body. It's one of the reasons actually that I wear like these tight garments. I mean, my whole wardrobe is all exactly the same because I found some clothes that actually hug onto my body and can kind of attenuate some of those sensations. But one of the things I learned early on is that one of the reasons that I was nonverbal is that my own voice was causing me sensory issues. I had to learn how to speak an octave and a half higher than my actual speaking voice to be able to tolerate my own voice. So that was a problem.
Hmm.
And then once I got into school, I realized that I had number and like grapheme synesthesia. I would see shapes and colors when I thought about numbers. The methods that other people would teach me to try to do mathematics never made any sense to me. I would do things my own way, and I would always get the right answer, but it caused a lot of problems with my instructors.
Yeah, I
Um,
can relate. I had the same problem. Where's your work? I did it in my head. No, you didn't.
and yeah, so I had those frustrations. I also came from that age in that generation in the 80s before we started passing out diagnoses like slips of paper. So, I didn't actually get an autism diagnosis until I was 19, and I went to join the military. And the median age of diagnosis now is 4 years old. So
Mhm.
to me, to try to think of how different my life would be if I would have learned that about myself, a decade and a half earlier. So that's just Brobdingnagian, but
Totally.
had an attachment to the way that words sounded, the way that words looked. And so, because I wasn't engaging in the use of a social vocabulary, because I didn't have any friends, um, my relationship with language was so strange. And I had this experience where, I would use words, and because they weren't common parlance, people have no idea what I was talking about. It was alphabet soup to them. And so I had to learn early on that the working vocabulary of people was actually much smaller than I thought it was. And I didn't have the social exposure to know better. So
Right.
a lot of social problems from that too, because people would have presumed that I was being condescending, or um, because I would stop to define words because I was uncertain if people knew them, that may come across as imperious, or if I was like it meant like I was denigrating their intelligence somehow because I
Perfect for
explained
an
something.
educator. I was kind of the same as you. Didn't have quite the challenges younger. However, my mother was an English and Lit teacher, and Dad was a tool and die maker, machinist, and both of them played music. Dad played the flugelhorn, cornet. Mom played oboe, clarinet, and sang in a choir. Taught music for a while. Found out that that wasn't her. Dealing with a classroom full of cacophonic, music was just not her thing. Um, and yet there was this encouragement of vocabulary development, right? They were on me, they'd use words in context and say that, you understand what I meant. And if I didn't, then I had to go look it up in the dictionary, right? And so you develop this huge vocabulary. Yours developed a little differently, but how do you use that? When you're talking to normal people, the words that you use, they don't understand. And then when you do stop you see it in their eyes, right? So you stop to explain the word you just used, and then you get that kind of response like you mentioned.
Right, because then at that point you're engaging in pleonasm, and then people are accusing you of wanton lexicophanism, and you're using all this sesquipedalian language, and it's all completely incomprehensible. And yeah, no, I totally understand. So I went through that journey, and when I got to my 20s, I'd had probably maybe 50 autistic special interests by that point, where I just kind of deep dove into something and just let it consume me. And I asked myself kind of an interesting question, because I read Carl Sagan's the Dragons of Eden. If you've never read it, I'd really recommend it. He really, I guess, to give a synopsis, he talks about, if we go off of the premise that an evolutionary model brought rose to gave rise to human consciousness, that what kinds of interesting things might we be able to say about human consciousness then, if an evolutionary paradigm is responsible? What neurophysiological differences are there? What differences in cognition? Because our experience on that, the clock of the universe as human beings is just in those last few minutes on the
We're a
on the
speck.
clock. A speck on a speck on a speck, tiny tiny blue dot. And so what might effects might that have on things like bias? What effects might it have on our psychology, on our way to recognize the humanness of other people, on empathy, and I found that fascinating. And so, I'd gone so much of my life not understanding other people, And I thought maybe that was the bridge that might do it, that maybe I could synthesize with the way that I think a
Sure. Well, that's a
fundamental
rabbit
understanding
hole
of the
with a
world.
lot of burrows.
Yeah, yeah. And but when I did that, I made the normal missteps that people do when they're neurodivergent. I tried masking. I tried just emulating the behavior of other people, but with context blindness. And
Hmm.
I realized what a lot of people do when they go through that process, that you feel a sense of imposter syndrome in your relationships because you're emulating that behavior, but it's not native to you. And so when
Yeah,
you
you're never really fully authentic. There's always a part of you you feel like you're withholding, and it feels
false, right? And
it hurts,
And when
right?
you do finally get those relationships that you're dying for, then you have this feeling that if you were your actual self, that they wouldn't exist, and therefore the premise of receiving that, it turns into self-sabotage. So I learned the wrong way to do things first, but
I think
I
we all do.
well, it's been a process of failing upward, and I think having respect for my failures and what I've learned from them, and
I
after I
love how
went
you
through that
put that,
journey.
failing upwards, because we're all, we have this 70,000 thoughts a day, right? Three quarters, if not more, are all self-deprecating because we fail down instead of fail up. We
Well, and then
don't recognize
actually
it.
that ties into what Sagan was saying too, because if you go off of the evolutionary paradigm for our thoughts, um, your brain actually has a lot of great reasons to hold on to negative experiences more than positive ones. Psychologists disagree. It's anywhere from 5 to 50 times the primacy with negative experiences. So,
Mastery and the significant emotional events, right?
right, and it's why for reprocessing too, why we'll lie awake at 2:30 in the morning thinking about that job interview that didn't go well 2 decades ago. We reprocess those negative emotions because it's predilected for survival. If a lion chases us up a tree, the brain wants to remember that. So the next time you're in that situation, you know what to do. But the problem is that creates a funhouse mirror narrative for the human psyche. We develop imposter syndrome because we only remember our failures with real clarity.
Sure. And
And
the habitual acts are not those that empower, they're those that disempower.
so I think going through that whole process has been really instructive for me. It did definitely change the way that I look at failure. There's an anthropological context there too. There's this liminal phase we go through. I think the best metaphor I've been able to relate it through is that when you're watching a child stumble in the process of learning to walk, we smile to ourselves watching that stumbling because we know where that process is going.
Right.
But once we move into adulthood, we change the way that we look at failure. We don't see failure as the absolutely necessary thing that needs to exist in order to acquire skill, that no person acquired a skill without failing to acquire it. And instead we learn to denigrate failure and to have so many emotional feelings about it that we
Sure.
can't use it to draw upon in order to succeed. And then also I just want to mention I smoke when I'm talking because of the synesthesia. It keeps me from smelling and tasting things. So when we're talking about different topics, like let's say talking about my childhood, if I don't have something suppressing my sense of taste and smell, my brain just goes absolutely wild. So I sometimes I use like mentholated cough drops. But those aren't really good for video conversations. I'll start clicking things against my teeth and all of that. So just this is a solution that works for me. I know
Oh,
that I know that there is a social view of smoking in general, but I'm just to give a little qualifier there.
I appreciate that, and I understand the reasoning too. Probably more so than most, because we all have things that we do that help us manage functionality better. And so I appreciate that. And thanks for revealing that too. Um, Now, as you were doing your deep dives, and I can fully appreciate the obsession on one thing at a time to find out because you're seeking knowledge, right? You want to know. The curiosity is there. How do you see that relating to your view of the norm in the public experience right now? It seems that there's an uptick slightly since COVID with the sequestration and the ability to self-examine. Some took it, some didn't. How do you see that reflecting and how you see this um, evolutionary emergence?
Well, I mean, there's a multimodal answer there. I think I I'll kind of touch a little bit. We'll lily pad for a few different things.
This will be fun.
One thing that struck me is that all of the people who were, talking about the changes that need to happen in education, there's this presumption that it is far too difficult to change a system after it's already in place, and you have to just keep on trying. You can't toss that system. You have to just keep on working on the system and trying to make little changes.
Right.
And yet, when COVID happened, we all just snapped our fingers and we all moved to online classrooms and changed everything all at once. And it is strange to me, especially after writing the Octopus Movement's paper on education, that people will say that. And I'm big on cognitive dissonance. I like pointing it out. They'll,
Sure.
they'll, there's so many clear things that we could be doing to do better with our education system. And we can recognize that COVID is the global pandemic. It's an emergency, and we can just snap our fingers and make a change. And yet, 54% of Americans read at a sixth grade level. We can't
Sure.
see that as a
Well,
reason
and
to
that
snap
turns
our
it from
fingers
an
and make a change.
emergency to an emergence.
An emergent emergency. It's it's silly to me that we could snap our fingers like that and make changes and recognize that that's an emergency, but that the huge problems that we have with literacy and critical thinking and all of that's not an emergency, and that we can't just snap our fingers the same way. It shows that there's a dissonance there, that it's more about
Absolutely. I had the
our
same
comfort.
type of experience, and I really wished I'd been on that um, in the think tank on that because in the 90s, I taught high school, several different locations, special ed, um, self-contained special ed, full charge of two different charter schools, and teaching at a residential treatment center. So I saw probably every educational environment one might be able to, and saw what was missing and ended up writing a business plan for my second master's degree on holistic educational village that focused on mind, body, spirit, planet, and cosmos relationships. Because as we get older, we realize, oh, these are important. We find in the rabbit holes that we seek, right? We find these systems that are applicable that have been ignored because of the prevalent belief system. And so now, as these are being explored and discovered, we're, especially when we're older, we recognize the significance and the value of them. Yet we're not, like you say, we're not revamping the educational system to include those. Now, my wife was born and raised in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. She was taken through their educational system as a pianist and became a piano pedagogue. Their system was designed so that at 5 years old, there was an assessment of attitude, aptitude, skill set. And then they built their education plan from there. That is so simply commonsensical.
Well, right, and it's all about the cognitive dissonance too, like the idea that we're using more and more standardized tests, but then in study centers around the United States, for example, we're teaching kids how to cover up the question and eliminate certain answers, and the idea that you're literally teaching a method to circumvent the method that's
Yeah,
being
you're
used to
doing
test you.
hacks instead of true education, which is to draw out.
That should demonstrate that it's not working, but it doesn't.
Right.
And it's silly. It's cognitive dissonance, and so that's
Yeah.
one lily pad, right? Another is that there's this incredible opportunity when everyone has to take this time to withdraw to work on the self, and so many people avoided that opportunity. That was an opportunity to be able to work on personal development, to learn a new language, to reevaluate the way that you're communicating with people, to check your ability to engage in empathy with people. There was so much that people could have done with that time, and yet at the same time, all people did was focus on distraction. And
Well, and France gave Netflix away for free so that people could sit home and binge watch.
yeah, that's a cultural thing there too. So
Yeah,
there's that
true.
element.
However, those are the kinds of things that happened as a result to continue the distraction, let's say.
Right. I was more saying it's a cultural thing, and that we have a propensity to we have a propensity to be permissive of these lackadaisically involved behaviors that
Mhm.
that we surround ourselves in friend groups with people who make us more comfortable being ourselves instead of um, different people that are different versions of the people that we want to be. Um, there's so many different ways that we could approach authenticity from like a Kierkegaardian standpoint.
Sure.
Um,
Did you find that in your explorations that you sought at some point began seeking people that challenged you to understand more?
it
My dad told me that, I was growing up, he was so irritated because he kept saying, "Wow, you're hanging out with the wrong people. Find people that challenge you and hang out with them." Unfortunately, because of my own level of intelligence, they weren't available.
Well, there's a lack of community too. Like with one of the other things about the neurodivergent experience is being able to connect with other people who have those different similar experiences to be able to draw on a social body of knowledge to develop those social relationships. And that's when 1 out of 44 people've got autism, that's difficult. It's difficult to see that that's even something that you need. So that was certainly an aspect. Um, I think another lily pad to touch on during that time period, and this is just my opinion, but it definitely showed us that this idea of having to go to work and work a 9 to 5 job, that wasn't necessarily the way that things needed to be. That we had to have less investment in under the auspices of physical locations, that we were able to take all of these jobs that we assumed that we need to go and check in on a time
Sure. Well,
card.
it's a prevalent system that's been implemented for a long time, and it's been profitable for those in charge of it.
It's just the hegemonic and counter-hegemonic, and I agree with that.
Yeah,
I think it's important because it serves as an actual real life example for people who might question those ideas. So that's why I'm
sure.
touching on it.
Right.
Um, I think it caused us to start having uncomfortable conversations with our loved ones and start addressing communication issues. Everything from separation and divorce rates, changed. Depression, uh, social isolation, obviously was a factor. People had to recognize that interconnectedness and being able to be in social groups is an actual need. That it wasn't just something that you know
Hmm.
softer science, that it actually had a physiological effect on well-being. Um,
Sure.
so there's so many multimodal aspects of that answer that you could touch on. We could probably spend the whole hour touching on that. That's just a few cornerstones, but hopefully that starts to give an answer.
Well, maybe in the future we can have a further conversation about it and actually affect some. So in this um, leapfrogging across the lily pads, what did you find was evidence, if you will? And let me preface this. So uh, it seems that there's a natural system with it built into us that we haven't discovered except in recent times we've begun to understand quantum relationships.
Sure, sure.
And we haven't really extended that into, okay, what's that really mean on a biophysical level? And how do I know Valentina Morovna, a Russian academician, put out her dissertation called "The Global Mutation in Humanity." It gets so excited, I want to talk fast, right? Slow the fuck down. Um, so in that presentation, she shares that in the 10 years of research that she had done, showing the discoveries in science that we are actually genetically evolving toward a higher level of consciousness.
Yeah, and that being around other people has multiple epigenetic and psychological and neurophysiological changes on us as well. Now, there's a reason that you can't just raise a baby with no touch and have it survive. That there's so much there to unpack, but
Sure.
there is definitely an important effect there, and I think that personal acknowledgement. But this would be another lily pad, but I think another thing
Yeah,
about
I'm all about leapfrogging. Tangentialism is my life.
Buffo. So, you know, moving along on the little toad hop, I think that another aspect that we could touch on is that the biomechanism of empathy. That
Hmm.
going through Sagan's lens, let's just say that that perspective is correct. I'm not here to make any assertions about anyone's reality, but let's just say for a moment we accept that premise. Um, the idea that if let's say two tribes of primates split up, that this tribe has to care about its own survival more than this tribe. That's not doesn't have that object permanence that's right in front of it. That
Mhm.
there is an othering that happens, that we have our own little community of the people that we see and interact with every day, and we attribute humanness to them. And then the people who are outside of our immediate sphere who don't have that object permanence, we intrinsically, from a biological perspective, it's like filtering. We care less about their survival. We care less about their agency, about their experience than we do our own. Because the truth is if we all woke up every morning and had to process the experiences, suffering, and journey of every single human being on the planet, we would all be crying into our breakfast cereal. So there is a biomechanism there that protects us from that, but it also disconnects us. And I think that there's this phenomenon in the United States where you have celebrities and they go off to another country and all of a sudden those people become real. They start interacting with them one on one and actually attribute real humanness to them. And then they all come back and they all want to adopt babies from every country and become UN
Right, right.
humanitarian ambassadors because all of a sudden, big aha light bulb moment, these are actual people and their brain can finally recognize it. There's a need, I think, as a global community for us to assign some type of compensatory effect to be able to overcome that biological limitation, because many of the systems that we have in our brain and our body, that are our predilections for survival, do keep us from seeing truth. If I'm looking at what I see with my eyes, I'm not actually seeing that. I'm seeing what the reflection of that. It's what
Right.
light is coming off of it. I got the absorption band spectrum, and then I have different physiological differences in my eye from the next person who's next to me, and different numbers of cones and rods. We don't actually see the same color, even though we're all pointing at the same thing and calling it red. My
Mhm.
my body has this experience of being still in this room, even though I'm hurtling through, a spiral arm galaxy at
Yeah,
tens of thousands of.
26,000 miles an hour
Yeah.
spinning on the Earth, and but who knows how fast through the solar
And
system.
and your brain has to ignore that information for you to move on with your day-to-day
And
life.
and yet there's this natural order, patterns, rhythms, cycles within that, the spiraling, and we take no notice of that natural structure in forming our world.
Right, right. And I feel like that was another thing that happened with COVID, another lily pad, is that for a moment we started to acknowledge a global community. We started to get on Zoom calls to reconnect with one another. We started, having more contacts outside of our immediate local range because that became less important when hanging out with other people. And those are the kinds of things that need to happen in order for us to circumvent this echo chamber that we've been in, where globalization just becomes this abstract concept, and to actually start having thoughts and feelings that are in accord with that.
When you would think the natural, logical path in this evolutionary process would be to realize, we're no longer feudal, we're no longer, territorial or national, we're global, right? We share one planet, even though we're trying to fight over the territory. Have we not learned that yet? Obviously, we haven't. It seems like we're in that process where it could actually happen, though.
Well, I think it gave us a peek. It gave us a peek that you and I are not necessarily so separate, that in fact we might be just hands pushing up different pieces of the same blanket and looking at
Mhm.
one another, and that our individuation may be the lie that our senses are telling us. And it's not that I think that it's truth, right? It's just there has to be a suspension of disbelief for a moment to try to consider different viewpoints on reality.
Mhm.
Consider for a second that it is evolutionarily supported that we all have an individual identity, that we are not all just variegations and distances between molecules between you and I, and that it's not just two different pieces of the same universe talking with one another, that we are individuals, because that's what allows us to make natural selection decisions. But that doesn't
And even
necessarily mean it's truth.
Well, yes and no. And the reason I say that, more of the yes part, is that historically, we had this in our prelim. The Vedas revealed that we're all divine threads, part of the tapestry, right? Incarnate, connected to the one source, whatever you want to call it, and still individuated and capable of God consciousness. Well, what's that mean? What I believe it to mean, and I'm open for, whatever, is that,
Debate potatoes. Yes.
yeah, potatoes, potatoes, tomatoes, tomatoes. Um, that individuated thread has access to the specifics in an infinite intelligently way for the individual to ask questions and get feedback and find their thread in that tapestry. Now,
Or
okay,
the flip perspective, maybe consciousness is the illusion. Maybe the conscious mind, the temporary state of your brain that allows you to have consciousness right now is a temporary state of the brain. And when you wake up on your pillow tomorrow, that's actually a different consciousness, and it's drawing on the chemically and physiologically stored memories in your body. And it has the perception of a singular narrative, but it's actually a different person stepping off of the transporter pad. The idea that we can take a few different perspectives and think about them, that's one of the problems today, I think, is that there is a culture, we've developed a culture of finger pointing and no dialogue.
oh
And
yeah, we haven't figured out that, oh, if I'm pointing a finger, I got three of them coming back at me, so I better be paying attention.
it's the idea of being able to listen to people that you disagree with and not just hit the block or the ignore button. One of the downsides of that COVID culture, and it got us even more into social media and all of that, is
Yep.
there is a desire to keep the online space into this thing that's just this happy, fun place for entertainment. And when we come across opinions that we don't like, we just have to hit a button to kill dialogue. And we're going to have a lot of dialogue if we want to be able to enact change. So I did see that as a negative trend. You know, I tried listening to like a radio show broadcast just from like 50 years ago, and you have all these different people from different walks of life, and they all have radically different opinions about things, and they all sat and patiently listened to one another's point of view. Say, well,
Mhm.
I disagree with you on this, but I agree with you on that. And the idea that you could meet someone who has a viewpoint that you vehemently disagree with, even from a moral and ethical standpoint, but that person could also have knowledge of one thing that could completely change your life that they do differently. But you would
Sure.
have to listen long enough to that point of view that you disagree with to be able to hear that part. And
And the listening and the questions, right? To be able to ask the critical questions without attachment to the answers and just be available, you might learn something.
and that takes us to our last lily pad, which is to reference your question. I think that there is an epistemological need to be able to separate information from knowledge, and that the more access that we've gotten to AI and the internet, um, that it has wounded our ability to critically think. That uh, we find enough people who agree with our perspective, no matter how rare our perspective may be, that we can stay in our silos of thought and not question ourselves and
Mm.
learn how to critically evaluate information and account for our own biases. And um, I think the metaphor that I've used in the past that people relate to the most is you could go to sleep watching the History Channel and have an incredible dream where you were a woman in 17th century England, and you know your name, and you know your husband's name, and you know your kid's name, and you remember the house, and then when you wake up you write all this experience down in a dream journal, and then maybe 5 years later you have this opportunity to go to Europe, and you're still curious about it because you had this really intense dream, and you go there, and sure enough there's the house, there's the headstones with the kids and headstone of your spouse, and you'll go the rest of your life believing in reincarnation because you fell asleep watching the History Channel, that your input colored your experience, and then you had your own confirmation bias, and then you had an experience that was so profound that it caused you to make emotional decisions and insert that into your cognition, and then instead of learning how to question your own experiences, that led you down a rabbit hole where you're no longer able to hear a conflicting point of view because you believe you found the truth. And
Sure, sure.
you know
Well, that's
being
like
open to
Terry
that
asked the other
too.
day. in our uh, in our marathon, he'd say, well,
Right.
what question do you ask yourself? And, invariably it's like, am I crazy?
It's
You
such
know,
a dark word, marathon. I always think about that
um,
person like falling over and dying at the end of running
oh,
that distance to deliver the message. And everyone's, oh, I'm running a marathon. No, you didn't.
yeah, yeah,
You're
yeah.
still here. Um,
Well, it was
yeah,
wonderful, wonderful, and experience, and like saying that he asked that question, and I had to say, am I crazy? Because by asking that question, it allows me to move beyond my own perceptions, even perspective, of which brings the perceptions, because your perspective changes, your perceptions automatically change. It's given me the ability to question my truth to the point of everything's sacred and nothing's sacred, right?
difference between a belief and an idea. And
Right.
it's
And then there's the experience. Okay. So that the experience that you have, whether it's validated by others or simply yourself and your own awareness of that truth for you in the moment, it gives the opportunity to begin to explore other possibilities and look for other connections that might suit you better. A resonance thing, the quantum physics, the quantum entanglement, or the physiological level with others that draw you and you draw them. The new phrase is what you seek you is seeking you kind of thing. Um, and it's kind of like I see it as almost a tesseract where you're throwing your intention to find out in front of you, and then the quantum world says, okay, here's our query. Let's put something together and feed it back, right? And this is kind of a constant motion that we have that we don't really recognize how well we create our realities as a result.
with the self too. I mean, when you study psychology, you learn this narrative, famous psychologist. Um, he had this experience where he had like a nanny, and he remembered someone trying to like abduct him, and the nanny saved him. And the parents gave the nanny a gold watch, and he had this whole defining experience. And then, like 30 years later, she came back and gave the watch back and apologized because it didn't actually happen. It was a fish story. But because he had that immersion in that narrative when he was younger, his brain fabricated the memories. I
Mhm.
have a friend who
Well,
was once.
confabulation is a problem.
Yeah, and it creates source amnesia, and it can create problems of identity, and uh, the idea that the things that you think you know to be true, that memory is not necessarily an accurate order of events, that you have to have a suspension of your own belief as well, in real
And how that
time, just with
affects you in the
yourself.
present moment. Are you able to disassociate from all of that and be present enough to be aware and conversant in that environment that you're in now, also without any provocation of what fears or concerns you might have about the future?
And that's why I think that it's that whole belief versus identity thing, that the knowledge that as a human being, the things that you are most sure are true may be a result of your brain taking your bias and changing your experience, and that experientially it's true. Like in a deterministic universe, let's say, free will is an experience. If you have blindness to all the information that's making up your decisions, you still experience free will.
Sure.
Just like I experience
Choice.
color, even though color is an abstraction, that doesn't really exist either. So I think that the more that you learn, the less you realize you know. And one of the things that gives me the most respect about people is people who are able to suspend their certitude and listen. And that's something that is of critical importance in an information age where the amount of information that we have to epistemologically separate gets larger and larger. Why critical thinking is the skill that we need to teach kids now,
Yeah, that's the other
because
national deficit, right?
the ability to ask the right questions is what allows us to use AI the best. And if we can't teach that skill to kids, then they're not going to be able to function in a role with AI because they're just going to give it a surface level enough question that they're just going to find a statement that already agrees with with what they thought. And that's a
Right.
danger too. Today's
Well, and
kids
as
are
you build the
just,
layers, even without AI, as you and I experienced it in younger, me less because it wasn't, computers weren't even around then. The queries, the questions, the curiosity, okay, I've got this information. What about this? Okay, that information is supplied now. Okay, that leads to other, more questions where you'd
and
like,
what do I know about the source and the reliability and the significant figures of that information and
yeah.
how much of my data should rely on that? And critical thinking skills need an overhaul in general, but not being able to use good use case examples and give them to kids, and then also allow them to collaborate with other people that are different than them. Those are some of the major conclusions that I was able to take from a lot of our input on the paper. And I had the honor of being on a teacher podcast after I composed that, and gets asked some questions by the educational community, which was really cool. And then
Yeah, no doubt.
I also had the distinct honor of speaking at the United Nations about at the autism awareness event about my experience with autism. That was really great. So I think that getting to hear these other narratives and being able to listen to different points of view, we all can maybe on surface level agree that that's a good thing, but when it comes to listening to different points of view on the things that we were most passionate about, that can be hard for some people, and that's another one of those elements of cognitive dissonance that I try to fight.
Hmm. How do you see that being fought best? Not that we're
Behavior.
fighting it, but we're exposing it and nurturing it to grow, right?
Behavior. Find the kinds of behaviors that you personally need to engage in to be able to get the most out of that, and then come up with a plan to be able to put those behaviors in place, and you'll be better for it. The ability to self-engineer is incredible in this day and age. But the people who use it, the percentage is so small. It's like
Well, we're still, I'm a boomer. You're X, right?
I can't I can't really relate to any of that because I didn't even have friends until I was 25. So to
Okay.
assume that I have a generational tie to a particular culture, I don't even have a gender association
Okay.
because of my
Well,
lack of involvement in the
pardon
social
me
paradigm.
for, yeah, but okay. So at any rate, age, maturity, availability. When I was younger, didn't have it. Still had the ability to inquire and develop that critical thing. My parents, gifted or cursed as I may be as a result, taught me how to ask good questions and how to follow a line of thinking and explode it into however it needed to be in order to find what information was available at that time and be as clear and concise and um,
Did you,
complete.
did you ever get exposure to the GATE program when you were younger?
No, see, I grew up in a very small town,
Um,
was tested early. My parents never told me the results until my 30s, and uh, consequently didn't know what to do with me. There were no gifted programs, anything like that. I just didn't have it available. Now, had they informed me of my intelligence level when I was younger, I might have had a little different perspective and used that differently instead of playing around and goofing off and still making grades, being a stellar athlete and all that kind of stuff. That was part of who I was, but there was still this piece that was missing, right? That wasn't fully utilized. And uh, then you have the, okay, well, things are as they were. Everything's perfect. I didn't need to know it then because, later in life it would, I'd still find out that I'm able to have conversations with guys like you.
well, my journey was just so unexpected. Because I went through that whole process of self-development. I've been studying psychology now for 22 years,
Uh-huh.
and I never in a million years expected that I would be relating any of that process to anyone else. It was just for me. It was because I was isolated, because I was alone, because I didn't have friendships, because I mourned the lack of ability to have friendships and to interact with others and understand psychosocial dynamics. And so when I moved into my 30s and I started teaching applied behavioral psychology and applied cognitive neuroscience to people, that was so unexpected for me. I mean that I literally taught in the engagement ring industry in the Pacific Northwest. I taught engagement ring salespeople how to better connect to their clients, their customer base. I got to speak at to C-suites at Tesla as part of an event for executives about communication. And at one point, I was put in charge of a neuromarketing team with like 5 PhDs below me, one in psychopharmacology and the others in cognitive and applied neuroscience. And
Mhm.
it was 3 months into that before they asked me, that's a really fantastic perspective. Where did you get your PhD from? And I'm like, I don't even have a community college degree. The piece of paper was never important to me. I've been doing this for 2.5 decades, and they had absolutely no idea. So
Yeah.
I think the way that we
Do
acquire
you think
knowledge,
education is more to make us job worthy? Because the curiosity ought to
but
be
does it
big.
though?
That's my
I mean, we
question.
we don't even teach kids how to balance a checkbook and pay their taxes. Are we preparing them for life?
Uh-uh. Not with the current educational system, no. It prepares them to go to work. It doesn't prepare them to think. It doesn't prepare them to develop relationships. Other than the cursory, social team norms and things like that, it doesn't teach them skills as to how to love and be loved,
I mean, I
right?
learned more on my debate team that I apply in my day-to-day life than I did ever from anything I learned in high school. I think that there is this real problem that we have today where people come out of higher education and they get their piece of paper and they say, "Thank God that's over."
Hmm.
And the whole point is to get us excited about learning and to be able to inform our journey the rest of the way. That I wrote about this, the death of the penny university. It used to be that you go to coffee shops and places around like a place of higher learning, like a university, and you could sit down as a member of the public and listen to great minds debate ideas, and you could learn so much from that whole process. And now so much of learning is just siloed, and it's
Well, yeah, and these are the side. There's a couple of things that you just reminded me of. And one of them in my second master's in organizational management, one of the classes. Now, I was there to build the Spectrum Academy. That was the name of the village or school, to build that plan. I was there on my own dime. This was University of Phoenix and on ground, and the rest of the class was there on corporate dimes to build their resume and travel up, and most of them getting tuition reimbursement, right? So they were having problems with me asking questions beyond the text and going into areas that they weren't familiar with. That so much so that several of them, a group, I guess, went to the teacher and the instructor came to me, and I'm like, okay. So I waited for a moment in class one night to kind of say, look, guys, you don't understand why I'm here. Maybe you'll understand if you understood why I'm here, you won't have such resistance to the questions that I ask because I'm here
and
to learn.
information's not here to be worshipped. You have to bring a certain barefoot of reverence to the process of
Right.
learning.
But once I revealed that, I had several come up, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize, however, they assume that everybody's there for the same purpose. And then with um, the other thing that I wanted to mention, the silos, as you I love to mitigate silos. I want to eliminate them as possible. I love Dee Hock's work with Visa initially and how that chaotic organizational development that occurred. With planetary citizens, we took the spiral dynamics model, which morphed into the co-creation wheel, 12 sectors of society. And so we're proposing to break down those 12 sectors and get people of stature in each one of those that are pioneers to start talking to each other. I want to do some panel discussions with them and ask these questions and see how they are already working together, if they are, if they're not, how they might, and what can happen in possibility to create a holistic system that actually works for everybody. Now, that's a long-term vision that may never happen. The pieces are there. There's a
As
lot.
a goal, it's great. Even if you never actually achieve it, but working toward that goal, you're going to do so many phenomenal things that it doesn't matter if you achieve it or not.
Yeah, I agree. It's already happening. Um, these kind of conversations are part of that. I wanted to build a reservoir, if you will, of information that then could be queried. And the three books that I have on the first 3 years are 8 pieces of 8 categories of information, how each guest responded. And then the ending chapter is the golden threads throughout them all, which is really the nuggets that we can take and use for the future. Um, and then also, for the planetary citizens plan, things, do you find that when you put your attention, intention, and interaction toward things, that liminal space becomes much wider?
I'll speak honestly. When I put my intention into things, it blows them up. Um,
How so?
because I'm I'm a very critical thinker,
I
and
can
I
tell.
don't operate off of the presumption that any of the facts that anyone has reached that point so far are actual facts.
So you
I
come in with the beginner's mind.
Yeah, I question everything. And when you start to question everything, it's same thing happens that happened to Socrates. People start realizing that they've just been repeating the same basic prayer every day as opposed to actually knowing where those thoughts or beliefs come from. Um, and there there is a Okay, so in my work, right?
Yeah,
I work with companies and individuals, and I teach them how understanding psychology in the brain allows them to better affect their own behaviors, but also to be able to better reach their audiences, to accomplish goals like public relations, advertising,
sure.
all of that.
Well, it's the inner outer bridge.
Right. And like for example, I won't say their name, but at one point I worked with an energy company in Italy, and there is a they went into it looking for some feedback, and what they didn't realize is that they were in such siloed thinking as engineers, as that personality type, that they presumed that just having the facts and figures and data would be enough to convince all of the people in their audience to be able to switch to them as a power company.
Hmm.
And not all people operate that way. Engineers do. So, sometimes people forget that the people who need their good or service the most are the people that are least like them.
Sure. And how often do we know about the three, the auditory, kinesthetic, and visual, right? Gardner brought out multiple intelligences in 1982. We still don't use those.
I wrote that paper too, Rethinking Intelligence for the Octopus Movement.
One of the things that I did in one of the charter schools, I created multiple intelligence learning centers. Nobody had ever done
Hmm.
that before. And it was like, okay, well, this makes sense. You got it, you use it or don't. And if you've got that kind of activity, uh, observable behaviors in learning styles that you can then attenuate and even accentuate, those kinds of things ought to be standard practice in classrooms, in my opinion. And why they're not, I still,
My point is that when you function like I do, like I play with and deconstruct systems and question systems to better
mm,
understand them and refine them,
right.
people don't always respond positively to that process.
Ooh, usually don't. I got booted out of the aerospace industry because I wanted to introduce interpersonal skills classes because they came to me and asked me what I was doing that made my work at the top of their charts. And I never even thought about it. I just
I
behaved like I normally do.
I literally get a surge of anxiety when someone asks me a question because I know that 99% of the time that person's not ready for my answer. And that's the problem. But the honest answer to your question is that when I apply my focus on something, when I get involved in something, when I care about something, I have a tendency to blow it up.
Okay. Let me ask you same question a little differently. When you become interested in something that you want to explore, do you find that your focus of attention and intention and interactions then bring a collective of resources into focus or at least visibility?
only after I've destroyed it. So when
Okay.
I was studying like mechatronics and electrical engineering,
Hmm.
um, they kept on doing this old tired thing of trying to explain everything as water pressure and plumbing, and I could not get them to stop. And the reason I couldn't get them to stop is that the people that were teaching didn't know it any other way. So I had to go to the chemistry professor, really sweet lady from Africa, was very patient with all of my questions, and I had to understand all of the intermolecular collisions, and I had to understand valence electron shells and why conductivity happened the way that it did, and why are some substances that change their band configuration at different temperatures and have paradoxical reactions to things like heat, like tungsten. I had to be able to ask all of those questions so that I could go back into that mechatronics class and ace it. And until I did that, I was failing it because the way that they were trying to transmit the information was so simplistic and so surface
Didn't
level and
connect.
so aimed at people that are not like me that I literally couldn't get what I needed in order to become passionate about it. And so I've learned that when I see a snapshot of something, I have to completely retreat from that presentation because so many people are attached to that paradigm and make my own and then rebuild it from scratch in order to
Hmm.
actually understand what's going on and then to be able to advance with it. And
Sure.
not
Well,
people
in a
don't respond
way,
positively to it. They
that
don't.
really makes sense to be able to disambiguate and dissect and make sense of it all from the beginning. And you can't do that, and especially for someone with your level of intelligence, the kind of questions that you ask because of the intricacies that you've developed with your critical thinking. And it's natural for you.
It's just breathing as breathing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't realize that it's going to cause the problems that it does. I end
But we
up
never
being
do because we
a
go in
disruptor
with
and I
pure
don't mean to
intent, just
be.
wanting to help, right?
Yeah, I'm not trying to be that person who's looking over the shoulder at their friend's suicide note and being like, you misspelled useless. I'm not trying to be that person, but when I care, that's what my brain does is it dissects details and people can't respond positively to it. So I've had to learn that the world has a certain reaction to the way that I think. And I've had to develop a sense of humor and I've had to learn to take a deep breath and to recognize different emotional states in other
Sure.
people and to
And
try
the
to do
world as it
things a different way.
was
And yeah.
would say, well, you got to fit in. And this is what we're taught. And so we change ourselves, we become codependent, we become these shells of beings in order to feed other people's imagination of what we ought to be. And instead of that, how do you see in these efforts, like with the Octopus Movement, Planetary Citizens, others, how do you see this shift toward acknowledging the diversity in greater ways to where it's actually valued?
So there is and this is an answer to your question. It's going to build up.
Okay.
Um,
Oh, I get it. You
there
got to
I have
build a
to
runway before the
right,
takeoff, right?
right. So forgive the landing strip.
Sure.
But if you were, let's say you were medically obese, not, let's say you literally had a tumor on your pituitary, whatever condition, right, had absolutely nothing to do with you as a person. The social metric has people looking at you and assuming that what they see is a result of certain characteristics that
Hmm.
they assign to you as a person.
Hmm.
And what I've learned
Every
from
time.
what I've learned from being neurodivergent is that my my symptoms are mistaken for character traits. That my like when someone tries to relate an emotion to me and I try to reciprocate by trying to come up with an experience that I've had that helps me relate to that, that's me trying to engage in empathy. But to them, they just see me talking about myself. I've changed the subject to myself. I'm self-involved. I'm narcissistic.
And I get
If
the same reflection. And why, all we're doing is trying to connect with the other person and share our connection to what they just said and what it means to us to create a deeper bond not create separation.
The human mistake is to presume that other people function the way that we do, that if since they're doing something, if we were doing that thing, we would be doing it for this reason, so that means that's why they're doing it.
Right.
And so I've spent my whole life with people assuming that I'm being condescending, or assuming that I'm a jerk, or thinking that I'm an asshole, and I already have so many social challenges to already start a notch down and have people assign those character traits to my symptoms. And I think the easiest metaphor I could use is if you had a friend who was in a wheelchair and they didn't offer to help you move, you wouldn't take that personally. But if you had a friend with ADHD who forgets your birthday, you will attack your friendship with them because of that. Because if you did that, that would mean you didn't care.
Hmm.
And I think that is a reflection on the basic problem of internalized processing with people with their egos, is that there is this presumption that everyone else in the world is a clone stamp of them, and that their behavior is a direct reflection of their intention. And that's just not true. But that's a beginning building block of that problem. And the ability to recognize that nonlinear thinkers approach things from different methods for so many different reasons. It's not just because of neurodiversity. It could be multidisciplinary. If you have a person who used to work in biomedical engineering, and then they used to design, ovens for kilns for ceramics for pottery, and then maybe they worked as a chemist and did, low sugar reactions in a lab. When that person finally decides to take a cooking class, the way that they bake a cake might be completely different from the way that you would think to bake a cake. And that's because of they're drawing on all that individualized knowledge and experience to do something a different way. That's a version of nonlinear thinking.
Sure.
Um,
Well, transformational coaching, which I do, takes advantage of that. It says, look, okay, you've got this skill set, this aptitude, this um, bucket of you, right, that's been applied to things that were at least paying bills for a while and making you somewhat happy. However, you've lost that pleasure and you're looking for something new. So let's look at how the skill set can apply to something that actually fulfills a passion that you have towards something that you're interested in. And
well, you see in the corporate world, they're like, oh, we're aligned, and so, oh, you don't believe in diversity then? There's this issue, right? You go into a corporate world, and they want everyone to use a singular approach, and that's alignment, and that being aligned toward a common purpose, and
this
functioning
is
inside
our
that.
process. Don't question it. We developed it for the last 20 years and it's worked well.
And my way of being involved in a process is to deconstruct it and question it. So does
Sure.
that mean that I'm a jerk, that I'm a dissenter, that I'm not a team player, that I'm all of these characteristics are then being assigned to me just because I'm trying to engage in the very thing that they're asking me to?
Sure.
That is a
Well, that's what I
fundamental
experienced.
problem. It's a fundamental problem.
And the experience, I have personal reference to that. I did my best. They asked me to do something. I put my best foot forward, which was far more than anyone in the department, evidently. I didn't know. And yet, because of that, I became a target. Even though I was doing my best to be a company person and help the vision and mission actually get done, and in ways that were truncating time frames, making suppliers happy, making um, end clients or end users much more happy because of the service they were getting. And so, when they came to me, I said, and asked me what I was doing, it's kind of funny because here's two supervisors walking up to my cubicle. What are they coming for normally, right? They're going to chew your ass for something. Well, it's one, two, definitely. And they saw the look on my face and they're like, relax. You're doing things great. And that's what we want to find out. How are you doing this? Because we don't get it. I'm the youngest person in the department. I'm 26 years old, $7 million a month in shipments, and 800 partners. And I'm like, juggling this stuff around like it was nothing. and getting people to do things that nobody else could, particularly by paying attention to the assholes and saying, hey, how can I help you do something for in your job, right? And
It's
oh,
we rush to judgment instead of asking about process. That's an easy
yeah,
thing that we could do. But I think something else that we could do, the real diversity and inclusion and real respect for nonlinear thinking is giving a space for everyone to share how their process is different. I've learned to self-advocate as an autistic person, to let people know I have sensory issues, to let them know I might info dump, to let them know that, if I could critically deconstruct something, it has nothing to do with them. But if we had a basic social interaction where we both open up by talking about how we're different as people, then there is no need for that. There is no need for, because
right.
we've already made the
But
space
that
for it.
means you got to be vulnerable, and people don't necessarily want to share what they think you are going to use against them, right? Which goes back to what you said earlier. Now, how do you suggest that that activity, that those silos are mitigated as we move forward? Are there ways to do that that could be implemented and have
It
effect?
it can be done through the Socratic method, but only if people are not offended by the fact that you're asking questions. If it's okay for me to say, all right, imagine that you're a person who's not an engineer, who doesn't deal with numbers and figures very well and isn't convinced by them, who is more affected by human experience, who is more affected by human faces, is more affected by their sense of community for trust. Assume that you're that person. What kind of website would that person need in order to convince them to use your product? If you
Hmm.
can ask the right questions, then you can give someone a cognitive reframe and you can pull them out of their rut. But you have to be able to ask questions.
Yeah,
And if they're not willing to entertain questions because of the suspension of certitude and the suspension of disbelief, then there's your problem.
sure. And you have to ask the question and listen authentically. You can't just ask the questions to lead them through a process to get to a result that you're wanting to have happen because there's no consideration of the other in that. It's like having two people that are in a challenge, right?
It's like the toxic listening culture we created in the 80s and 90s where we're like, yeah, regurgitate part of their statement, smile, nod, show that you're engaged. No, that's a terrible way to listen. The way to listen is to listen to that what that person has to say well enough that you can give it back to them and have them agree with it before you start in on what you have to say. If
yes.
you can satisfy to them that you actually understand everything it is that they're trying to say and why they're saying it and the process they use to acquire that position, then why wouldn't they take a moment and start listening to yours? But
Hmm.
it requires that olive branch.
And patience too, the moving slow to move fast. These things take time. And with the deadlines and commitments, um, usual, management systems don't allow for the time and space necessary to have these kinds of discussions and relationship building processes.
But it's important in relationships as well.
Absolutely.
Because I think the this semiotic blindness is what nails people. Because people will use words like love or happiness or joy or fulfillment or these incredibly important concepts, but they whitewash over it with a brush and they don't actually take the time to understand, well, what does that word mean to you? They'll
Mhm.
be so attached to disagreeing with your definition because of their own definition that they won't make the space and time to understand your definition, and that's a problem because it just means you're both using different words for
It
different
is.
things.
Now, I'm sure you probably had some relationships with HR departments and that nature, right?
Right,
So in one of my many hats was on the board of directors for then the American Society for Training and Development Arizona chapter.
right.
And in the process of that, um, we put together some conferences and one in particular called The Shift, um, challenging challenge to change, removing limitations, liabilities, and excuses in the workplace. And during that, I had conversations with a bunch of different CLOs and chief learning officers for
You
the
say reducing excuses?
yeah. And so the
So
whole thing,
people aren't allowed to explain themselves.
no, no, no. This was to give them accountability and responsibility to explain themselves, not offer excuses for their ineptitudes.
Ah, I see. Okay.
Okay. So it was designed to build a better unit, if you will.
Sorry,
And
I heard what I heard was is talking about excuses, and when someone's adversarial with you, they'll take any explanation that you have for what's going on as an excuse.
yeah, yeah, yeah. This was not that kind of thing. However, great catch. So in this, and talking with CLOs, this was during the time where 2008, right? 2009, market crash. HR departments were gutted as a result. When the training development areas of companies and corporations are intrinsically the most important, but they're not given that value because they're seen as an intangible expense. Why do you think that? I mean, you kind of explained that, and um, how did we shift that?
I think the first step is getting people to acknowledge what they feel they know to be true and to ask them if there is any other explanation other than the one that they think is most probable that could result in exactly the same answers. I think that gets people out of their first box.
Hmm.
Um, because I think getting people into behavioral change is incredibly difficult if they're so convinced that they found the truth that they're not willing to consider other options. So
Unless you
let
have a national or an international pandemic, and which is a disguised behavior mod program.
right. Forced cognitive reframing, right?
Right, right.
But if let's say, let's say you know about individuated consciousness, if I say to you, okay, what are some of the other possibilities that might give you exactly the same results in your experience, but the system is actually different, but the output looks the same? Is that the only conclusion that you can make from the data that you're seeing? Or are there less likely conclusions maybe in your mind that could
Perfect
also
example.
explain it?
Perfect example. I was at a science cafe with one of Lawrence Krauss's TAs, and we were talking about the God particle, right? And so my question was, is it possible that with two protons ramming at near light speed and the explosion wouldn't cause a particle, it would cause a rip in the fabric, and you saw that rip repairing and read it as the decay of a particle? And I got deer in the headlights.
Yeah, yeah.
Nobody ever asked that question.
Right. And that's being able to first accept that there are different possible explanations for what you're observing as
Hmm.
truth. That's the first step to being able to consider a different point of view. And I think it also gets people out of a mindset of having a position and instead gets them into a mindset of having an observation. And it's if you can create that kind of cognitive reframe, then you can continue that process
Hmm.
to start getting them to see that other people have positions that may result in the same data but are actually different interpretations, that there is more than one possible way to explain things, and that being able to consider those different possibilities doesn't necessarily negate their position. If anything, it could strengthen them by getting to hear those different points of view and understanding why some people believe differently. And then whatever the topic is, then you can actually start to talk about, okay, well, for people who have this approach or this understanding of the data, how do you create an inclusive program that addresses both of those points of view? Like that's when you start to get people to widen their lens a little bit more because you're acknowledging their position, but also getting them to acknowledge that it's not the only position that's
Right,
valid.
right.
Um, because people get caught up in this whole net of right and wrong. And if you think you're still in the room that you're in right now, you're already, you know,
Who was
that's
it that said um, nothing is good or bad, it's how we think that makes it so.
I mean, that's an extension of a few different schools of philosophy. I mean, you could
Yeah.
even take that all the way back to Descartes if you wanted to, but um, that'd be putting Descartes before the horse. Uh, but
But I'm
yes,
king. Right.
yes. But I think that but yeah, I think that's the best answer to your question is getting people to cognitively reframe. I think that's the first step. I think cognitive reframing is what gets people kicked out of their limbic brain and gets them up into their cognitive functions and actually gets them to the point where they're not just emotionally holding on with their talons into whatever they think truth is. If you can't kick them up into the higher brain out of the middle or the lower brain, you're not going to have much of a conversation. You're just going to bark at each other.
Right. Oh man, this has been just an amazing conversation. I loved it. I totally could spend hours with you just hanging out and chatting, right? Um, long form's long enough, and you know we're not a Joe Rogan, and I don't think people listen that long anyway. Is there something that you feel imperative that could offer some individual release or relief in what is coming for people to consider in this emergence of a new normal?
Um, I think asking more questions of the people that are closest to us about how they see the world differently and how it affects the way that they think and feel. Because those are the people that we get the most exposure to, the people inside of our families, inside of our close friend groups. Because if you can't learn to apply,
And the least likely to run.
right, those are the people that you have the ability to get the most practice with. And it's not that I think that let's say Myers-Briggs or the Enneagram system, or what Myers-Briggs was a bunch of statisticians trying to re-encapsulate Jungian archetypes, or
Right.
you can get into all of that. But let's say someone takes a personality test, your brother, your sister, your mother, your father, whatever, and you can recognize the differences in the way that you organize information, process information, experience the world, and start asking some interesting questions about how might that affect their decision making process, and can you see why they have a different opinion than you do about something. Anything simple.
Hmm.
If you can start thinking in that direction, and it's with someone that you interact with all the time, so this is a clear benefit, right? Because if you can better understand the motivations and the decisions and the emotions of that person, it is going to change your relationship with that person. Try it there first. If you can do that with the people that are closest to you, then that actually starts the set of behaviors and questions and thoughts that might allow you to be able to push that to an outside sphere. And that's the
And it
way
gives
that
you a
it'll be
safe
impactful.
realm to practice in.
100%. 100%.
Awesome. And sure, this has been just freaking amazing. I loved every moment of it. Hope you did too. And I thank you.
Oh, of course, absolutely. I'm a little tired. I've been in meetings for about 7 hours today, but it was definitely worth it.
Cool. Thank you. And namaste and in la catch. Thanks for sticking with us for this episode of One World in a New World. I'm Zen Benefiel, your host, and for myself and Anshar, thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.